Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, that's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org on the internet, and there the motto is individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and economic freedom in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, well, please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, like the Voice for Liberty on Facebook, or follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, this week on Wichita Liberty TV, Bryan Riley is a full-time advocate for free trade through his research and writing for the Heritage Foundation. Founded in 1973, the Heritage Foundation is a research and educational institution, a think tank in other words, whose mission is to formulate and promote conservative public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. Bryan Riley brings years of experience in trade and economic issues to his role as J. Van Andel's Senior Analyst in Trade Policy. He contributes to the influential Index of Economic Freedom, which Heritage publishes annually in partnership with the Wall Street Journal. Bryan joined Heritage Foundation in 2010. He especially enjoys serving as a mythbuster who counters inaccurate and misleading information that hoodwinks the public and undermines free trade. He grew up in Manhattan, Kansas, and earned a bachelor's degree in economics from Kansas State University and then a master's degree in economics from University of Southern California. He resides in Washington, D.C. Now, Bryan Riley. Well, Bryan Riley, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. Foreign trade is important to Wichita. It's thought that Wichita is very heavily dependent on exports, primarily because of our aviation industry. A lot of that's sold overseas. Plus, Kansas agriculture, a lot of that is sold overseas as well. And it also seems like agriculture is something that's, trade is something that's pretty important in this year's presidential election. I think primarily because Donald Trump is the front runner as of today, and also has some very strong opinions about trade. So, free trade, what's all that about? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I get confused. I think I'm usually pretty good with numbers and stuff, but I get confused talking about trade. So, what does free trade mean when we talk about a trade deficit? Could you explain to our viewers some of those topics, please?
Well, sure. And when we talk about trade at the Heritage Foundation, one of the things we produce is something called the Index of Economic Freedom, Bob, where we rank about 180 countries around the world. And I don't think you'll be surprised countries that have more economic freedom are more prosperous than those that have less economic freedom. And the same goes for their trade policy. So trade has been a lot more controversial in U.S. history than it is today. But when I go back, and if you look at our Declaration of Independence, for example, almost everybody knows that it mentions taxation without representation.
Right.
The line before that complains about the King of England interfering with our ability to trade with people in other countries. So it's been a long-term issue. Then you go back to our Constitution, and one of the important things that the Constitution did, among many, was it created a free trade zone among the 13 then colonies, 13 states, 50 states, so that we can trade freely among the 50 states. We don't have to worry about the governor of Nebraska saying, oh, no, we're not going to let that Kansas wheat in, or vice versa. And it's based on the basic definition of free trade, as I use it, is when you or I earn our paycheck, that's our money, and we get to decide how to spend it. Somebody in Washington, D.C. doesn't get to say, well, no, this particular group says you should do business with them. You shouldn't be able to buy imported products.
So free trade is kind of a fundamental principle of liberty and freedom, although I would like to say sometimes we'd like to prevent the Nebraska football team from crossing that border into Kansas, but those days are kind of over. But I think people are worried about, for example, suppose we buy an Apple's computer, Apple company buys an iPhone from its supplier in China, let's say $100 or something like that, and the iPhone comes over. How does that work into this balance of trade deficit that people like Donald Trump seem to be so concerned about?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm going to talk about the iPhone, but just when it comes to trade deficits, here's one reason I think people get confused about trade deficits. Bob, if you go out tomorrow and you buy a new Ferrari imported from Italy, I don't know how much that costs, $400,000.
Yes.
You've just added $400,000 to the U.S. trade deficit, our deficit with Italy. Now, that doesn't mean I owe anybody anything. It doesn't mean anybody in the United States owes anybody anything. It's just a phrase. Now, you just sent that $400,000 to Italy. You got a nice car, so you're better off. You wouldn't have bought it if you didn't think you'd be better off with the car than the money. The person in Italy's better off. They'd rather have the money than the car. Well, what are they going to do with that $400,000? They could stick it under the mattress. Odds are they're not going to do that. They're either going to invest in the U.S. economy, they're going to take it to the bank and exchange it for dollars, exchange their Italian money for dollars and buy U.S. exports. Either way, we benefit. So a lot of times people will look at a trade deficit that we have with another country and think that somehow money's being drained from the economy. But in fact, those dollars come back to the U.S. a lot of times to invest in factories, to create jobs. We've got about 6 million Americans that work in subsidiaries of foreign-owned companies like Toyota and Honda and BMW and others. So that's a good thing. So I think more important than the trade deficit is the question of freedom. And the more economic freedom people have, the better off they are. That iPhone that you mentioned, my iPhone, in the back it says assembled in China but designed in California.
Yes.
I can't see over my case exactly what it says. Most of the value of that iPhone it doesn't come from China. It comes from the Americans who design it and sell it, the high-tech inputs from Japan and other countries, the software. So it's a lot. So that iPhone might add $100 to the trade deficit, even though all China does is $5 worth of gluing it together, just to keep it really round off the numbers.
And I think also when we come back from our break, we talk about the United States deficit with China, but really it's individuals and companies that are doing this trading. I suppose the United States government does buy some things, but most of it, I think, is individuals like you and I and others making a trade there. So hold on to that thought, Bryan. We'll be back in just a moment with Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, Bryan Riley from the Heritage Foundation. So, trade is good, whether it's people trading with people in the United States or trading with people across the world. Why then do people like Donald Trump say we're losing to China, they're taking all of our jobs? Where does he get an idea like that, and is he right or not?
Well, I think it plays into people's fears, the fear that things are getting worse and not better. It's certainly true that we're losing manufacturing jobs in the U.S., just like we're losing farm jobs, but our agricultural output and our manufacturing output has never been higher. You have to look at the fundamentals behind the job changes. And the fact is we're getting more productive, and if you can produce more with less, I think most people would agree that's a good thing. Now, somebody can look at trade with China and look at the deficit and say that they must be cheating. They must be taking advantage of us somewhere. But if you look at all the trade and investment flows, not just the goods going back and forth, the amount that China sends back to the U.S. is equal to the amount we send to China. The trade deficit just looks at a tiny slice of that. So, for example, the federal government borrows hundreds of billions of dollars every year, not just from people in the U.S., but from people in other countries. So if the government borrows, let's say, $200 billion from China, those are dollars that could have gone to U.S. exports, farm products, beef, whatever. Instead, they're going to the government. So essentially, we're exporting treasury bonds instead of exporting privately produced goods. So that makes, so to me, if you want to blame somebody for the trade deficit, we should look at problems made here in the United States, and particularly in Washington, D.C. Because American companies can compete with anybody in the world if the government just lets them.
Yeah, but trade is often disruptive. You know, there's this video going around of the Carrier air conditioning company in Indianapolis telling 1,400 people that their jobs are going to Mexico. I think on YouTube that's been viewed 3.5 million times in the last month. So there's 1,400 people whose lives are being disrupted. And how do we tell them that really, no, this is better? And how can Donald Trump stop that even if he wanted to? He says he's going to stop it.
Well, that's the key question is how, or do you even want to stop that? And economists, lots of times, they'll say things like, well, we don't still want to be producing buggy whips, do we? And so that particular factory, I don't know why the jobs moved, but I do know that recently Audi announced they're building a new factory in Mexico instead of the United States. And they said, the reason we're in Mexico and not in Tennessee is Mexico has more free trade agreements. So we can bring our inputs in without paying tariffs. We can export our products more. So things the government can do include increasing free trade agreements, but having a reasonable regulatory and tax structure. But also, I think it is important to acknowledge and recognize that change or what's often called creative destruction, there is an element of destruction, where there's new technologies. How horrible is it that all the people that used to work at Blockbuster no longer have jobs? Right. Well, does that mean we try and maintain video rental stores forever? I don't think people would think that's a good idea. And if the United States starts saying, hey, well, we're going to make it, we're going to not let you, or we're going to penalize you somehow if you're a U.S. company and you move someplace else. Well, what does that mean for the 6 million Americans who work for subsidiaries of other companies from other countries that have chosen to invest here? Maybe those countries will start to say, hey, maybe BMW, maybe we don't want you in the United States, maybe we want you back in Germany. So it opens up a lot of really important questions.
And we do see from time to time some very explicit efforts by the United States or other companies to protect workers. I'm thinking that not long after President Obama came into office, we were worried about, well, I don't want to say we, but some people were worried about an onslaught of Chinese automobile tires that were produced less expensively than American automobile tire manufacturers could make them. So in order to protect American tire making jobs, President Obama added, I think, 35% tariff to the imported tires from China. And what did the United States do, or what did China do, I'm sorry, in response to that?
Well, that had a couple of effects. And President Obama actually talked about this in one of his State of the Union messages, how great it was. I protected these jobs. So unfortunately, we lost 2 or 3 jobs in every tire retailer and distributor industry for every job that was temporarily saved in the tire manufacturing industry. So you protect some jobs, you lose other jobs. And then whenever you do this, you risk that that China or whoever our trading partner is going to retaliate by putting tariffs on U.S. products as well. So it's impossible to protect one job without costing jobs someplace else and risking the big example is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of the 1930s, which exacerbated the Great Depression, where the U.S. said, we're going to protect our jobs. The rest of the world said, well, then we're going to raise our tariffs too. And it was disastrous for the U.S. and for other countries. And when you have economic conflict, you're more likely to have military conflict as well. So these peaceful, mutually beneficial transactions are the kinds of things that we should want more of.
I'd like to bring up about after our break, more about the peaceful nature of fair trade. But I do remember that in response to the tariff on Chinese-made tires, China put tariffs on the import of chicken parts from America, frozen chicken parts, I think. So presumably quite a few chicken processing plant workers and farmers suffered either loss of jobs or income there too.
That's exactly right.
That's how that works, and we find that all over whenever trade barriers go up. So let's take another moment off for a commercial break. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, Bryan Riley, an economist from the Heritage Foundation. So, China's our biggest trading partner, or is it Canada or Mexico?
Well, it depends on how you measure it, but Canada and Mexico are our top trading partners,
Okay.
North America and China.
China is certainly
Yeah.
an important trading partner. And there's some concern that China is reaching out militarily, doing various things, and there may be some tension there. So trade seems to be a way that we could have a cooperative relationship with China rather than a fighting one.
Well, and that's one reason after World War II that the U.S. really played a lead role in promoting reduced trade barriers here in the U.S. and in other countries as well, not just for economic benefits and for more commerce, but to help prevent the kinds of international tensions that can grow out of control. So the comment was made at the time that when goods do not cross borders, armies will. So trying to prevent those kinds of barriers to goods will allow for more peaceful, voluntary interactions. It doesn't mean that there'll never be conflict, but if you're my biggest customer, if I'm your biggest customer, we might want to think twice before we got into a fight with each other. So I think that's something that really is one of the benefits of trade that doesn't get talked about enough.
I think one time Thomas Friedman had a theory of diplomacy called the Golden Arches Theorem, which is that companies that are capitalistic and have McDonald's rarely invade other companies or other countries. I'm sorry.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. And with respect to imports, I understand it's real easy to think, well, everything we import means we must be losing a job because we're not making it here anymore. But number one, about half of everything we import in the United States is an intermediate good that we use to build something else.
So parts for, like I think the American automobile industry isn't about 1/3 of the parts of typical American cars imported, or some pretty big number
right,
like that.
Either from Japan or from Canada or from Mexico, and they're going back and forth across the border. So if we put tariffs on those parts, we're just penalizing our own manufacturers, make it harder for them to compete. But whenever we import a product from another country, the person in that other country, just like the Ferrari example I used earlier, they're going to use those dollars to either invest. Maybe they want to donate to the Heritage Foundation. Okay. Maybe they want to buy some stocks on the U.S. stock market, but those dollars come back. And the problem is sometimes those benefits are not as direct, and they're not so easy to see.
It's hard to see.
It's hard to see. But what we do know, and what our Index of Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation shows, is that the countries that are more open to trade and have lower trade barriers are more prosperous than those which are closed, which are restrictive.
And I guess an extreme example would be like a country like North Korea. They don't allow any trade, I think, of anything, and look at those people, how they suffer.
Exactly. So there's a lot more that goes into it than just trade. But you talked about the tires and the trade dispute between the U.S. and China over tires. But in the 1960s, we had a trade dispute with Europe over our poultry exports, and they put tariffs on our poultry. So we said, to get even with you, we're going to put a 25% tariff on your pickup trucks, which then were coming from Germany. We still have that 25% tariff today, even though the only Europeans don't export pickup trucks. But as a result, it makes it more difficult for foreign competitors to build products that maybe maybe Americans might like. You can buy a Prius that has a 2.5% tariff, but a pickup truck would have a 25% tariff.
Well, that's too bad. I might like to have a BMW pickup someday, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen.
Well, and what the U.S. car makers then did in the 90s when Chrysler developed sport utility vehicles and minivans, they decided, well, we should apply this 25% tariff. We should expand that to minivans and sport utility vehicles so we can keep the competition out. And fortunately, that didn't go through. And so as a result, we have more competition. And in industries where American companies are forced to compete, you have some of the best products in the world.
Innovation, higher quality, and lower prices, I think, usually. So
that's right.
There are some politicians who say, oh, I'm in favor of free trade, but it has to be fair and smart. And I kind of remember Murray Rothbard. Of course, he's kind of an anarchist almost, but he says you don't need a treaty to have free trade. So is either one of those two polar opposites correct, or is there something in the middle that we need to work towards?
Well, I think at a minimum in the U.S., if we got rid of all tariffs on all inputs that we use to produce things, that would be a good first step. Most economists would say, let's just get rid of all the tariffs. But politically, what we've tended to do is have trade agreements where we say, okay, we're going to take our tariffs down, and Mexico or Chile or Japan, you take your tariffs down too.
And there's some sort of World Trade Organization that arbitrates disputes.
Yeah, that makes sure. So it might. The trade agreements might be longer. People might say, well, all you need is a page to say, let's get rid of tariffs. Well, there have to be rules for how you're going to resolve disputes and things like that as well. So that's one reason that some of the trade agreements are a lot longer than maybe the pure free trader would say, let's just get rid of our tariffs. And that would be right. But when you have, let's just say, sugar producers in Florida, very powerful, who will fight to say you can't
import as much
sugar. As a result, Americans pay twice the world price for sugar. As a result, if you're then a candy manufacturer or a baker in Pennsylvania or Chicago, you may wind up saying, I got to move to Canada or Mexico so I can get my inputs at an affordable price. So sometimes U.S. trade policies actually drive companies overseas, and that same goes for our tax and regulatory and government spending policies as well.
I think there has been some good news as part of the budget agreement last year. I think now the ban on the export of oil from America, that's either gone or will be gone. Is that the case?
Right, and that's so bizarre to me because for so long the politicians tend to argue imports are bad, exports are good. But we had a ban on the export of oil. And I think whether you have a product in the United States and you want to sell it and you have a willing customer, it's yours. You ought to be able to do it. And if you have $1 and you want to buy something, if I have $1, I want to buy something, that should be my decision and not the decision of somebody in Washington, D.C. So, and those are the policies that, again, our Index of Economic Freedom, economic theory, history show those are the types of economic policies that make us better off in the long run. There definitely are winners and losers, but as Joseph Schumpeter mentioned the phrase creative destruction. The capitalist economies are always destroying some jobs and creating new jobs. And so we've lost a bunch of about 38,000 manufacturing jobs in Kansas since 1998. We've gained about 38,000 jobs in the health and social services industries. Is that good or bad or otherwise? Well, I think it's important to look at the big picture. The big picture is we have a lot more jobs in Kansas than we did in 98, a lot more jobs than we did when NAFTA was passed. So things are getting better.
Okay. Well, Bryan, we're out of time this week, so it's been a pleasure. Thank you for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV.
Thanks, Bob.
Well, that's all for this week. We'll be back again with another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks.